I think we're about to start. Welcome everyone to our second invited guest speaker talk. Thank you for coming here and being here physically. For those of us who are viewing this talk, participating virtually, also welcome. This is the first time we're streaming an event, so hopefully it will work out just fine. Today we are excited to welcome Dr. Ryuko Kubota of the University of British Columbia. She is a professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of British Columbia. Her research interests include critical pedagogy, critical multiculturalism, critical race theory, and language ideologies. She is a co-editor of Race, Culture, and Identities in Second Language Education, Exploring Critically Engaged Practice from year 2009. Also, Demystifying Career Paths After Graduate School, a guide for second language professionals in higher education, published in 2012. Professor Kubota is here to speak with us today about the topics of epistemological racism, Southern theory, and scholarly ethics. These are important and increasingly urgent issues, and we as language professionals ought to engage with them in debate. Professor Kubota's scholarship brings a great deal of clarity to these challenging subjects, and her talk today will be an essential contribution to our ongoing conversation about the role of language teaching in the university. I look forward to our talk and to a discussion afterwards. Please join me in welcoming her speaker.
Let me start. Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's my honor to be here. And so in my talk, I'm going to talk about these topics, but first, I'm not a literature specialist, or I'm not language teacher per se anymore. I consider myself as an applied linguist and language teacher educator. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from. And I used to teach Japanese in North America at Monterey. It's called the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey Bay, whatever they call it now. Monterey Institute for Studies in Education. I was there for altogether about 4 years, and then at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for altogether about 14 years. And after I moved to University of British Columbia in 2009, I moved to the Faculty of Education. So I stopped teaching Japanese. I still miss it, but that's my background. Okay, and so first I would like to talk about why I became interested in issues of race, racialization, and racism in second language education. Years ago, I got very interested in this field called contrastive rhetoric. I don't know how many of you have seen this How many of you have seen this? Okay, so this is a very famous article done by Robert Kaplan in 1966. So 1960s was a time when there was a large influx of international students to North America because of the change in immigration law. So many universities had to deal with international students from non-European countries, and composition teachers faced with different kinds of writing in English as a second language done by the students, right? So many teachers were puzzled by the rhetorical differences. So Kaplan at that time noticed cultural difference, and he proposed that each language has different thought patterns, and that influences how people organize their thought and put it into writing. So according to this model, English is supposed to be linear, right? Whereas Semitic languages, parallel structure, Oriental languages, Asian languages, has a feature of beating around the bush and coming to the conclusion at the end. Romance languages and Slavic languages have digressive pattern in different ways. Okay. So this caught a lot of researchers' attention, and ever since there has been a lot of studies on contrastive rhetoric. And Una Corner is another Indian scholar in contrastive. Nowadays they call it intercultural rhetoric, okay? Because of a lot of criticisms, they changed the name. But in 1966, she summarized many studies on contrastive rhetoric, particularly focusing on the comparison between English and Asian languages, East Asian languages, and concluded that these studies described English as linear, direct, deductive, logical, and writer responsible, which means that writer is responsible for making the meaning transparent for the readers, right? Whereas East Asian languages are characterized by non-linear, indirect, inductive, and non-logical patterns, and also reader responsibility, which means that readers are responsible for understanding the meaning between lines, right? Okay. As you can see, you see the cultural dichotomy, right? Yeah. And this has been criticized quite a bit because this resonates with, for example, Edward Said's Orientalism, right? So in Orientalism, he critiques how the images of the Orient are constructed by travel writing and other kinds of literature and other kinds of writing, portraying the Orient as backward and primitive and yet exotic. And those images are contrasted with Europe, images of Europe, the West, which is more progressive and forward-looking and so forth, right? So you see this cultural dichotomy is problematic, and it has the legacy of colonialism, right? Okay, and colonialism actually was sustained partly by racial distinctions, racism. So we need to really critically look at this model. And so in this model, English is described as deductive and logical, whereas Asian languages are described as inductive and non-logical. But these descriptions may have some value judgment attached, right? So English can be looked at positively, whereas East Asian languages can be looked at negatively, right? So what happens if Asian scholars actually promote and support this positive image of English and negative image of Asian languages? And these value judgments are not attached to these inherently. So you can actually switch, and then you can say, Asian languages, these patterns are positive, but then this is negative, right? Then what happens if Asian scholars or other scholars of color support non-English, non-European patterns and thinking positively? So I would address these questions in my talk. So I was interested in issues of racism and language studies. There have been many studies on race or racialization in language studies, but because I'm interested in epistemological racism, I'm going to focus on racism and language studies. Okay, and we can actually look at two separate but related fields. One is social linguistics, and the other one is language education. Okay, again, I'm from applied linguistics field perspective, so I looked at those two fields. Okay, so from social linguistics research, racist discourses have been examined, particularly in political, educational, business discourses, text analysis, and discourse analysis, right? And also some researchers looked at linguistic mocking. So, for example, mock Spanish. Mock Spanish is the phenomenon where white English speakers use Spanish to mock Latinos. Okay, mock Asian also, the non-Asian people mocking the way Asians speak in English, right? Okay. So that contribute to stereotyping and degrading racial minorities. Okay. However, this kind of linguistic mocking can be used strategically by minoritized people to express resistance. So, for example, linguistic mocking is used subversively by Latinx youth, and it can be called inverted Spanish. So it's a Spanish, type of Spanish in hyper-anglicized pronunciation, sort of mocking white people speaking Spanish with an accent, right? Or a Korean-American comedian uses mock Asian to subvert this meaning of stereotypes. Okay. In terms of language education research, researchers looked at racial inequalities and hierarchies reproduced in language education policies and practices. So, for example, and then they used various methodology like critical race theory, post-colonialism, ethnography, interviews, and so forth. So, for example, the themes that came out include conflation of non-native English speakers with non-whiteness, right? And colorblind ideology, superficial celebration of different cultures and racialized groups, which reflect a liberal multiculturalism, evasion of race by replacing it with culture, and racial biases in teacher employment and teaching materials. And these themes have been researched in language education studies. Okay. And in these studies, a critical gaze is cast on language users, learners, and professionals, but not on us as researchers. So the question that I'd like to pose is, how do our own scholarly activities produce and maintain racial hierarchies and inequalities of different academic knowledges and impact the institutional status of racialized scholars? Okay. Before moving on to the issue of epistemological racism, we need to understand the different types of racism. When we say racism, we always think of individual racism, individual bigotry, right? Okay. Which is also called racial microaggressions, which is everyday intentional or unintentional racial insults, right? Okay. So, for example, a scholar called Inari, who's a graduate from our program, who's an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University. She did doctoral dissertation on the experiences of teaching and learning English as a second language in British Columbia, where we live. And in one of the English Language Institute, it's an intensive English program for international students for short-term study abroad. There was only a few, very few Asian teachers of English as a second language. And one of them was Japanese-Canadian young woman, okay? And she is a native speaker of English, but she was like me, right? Okay. And she was always mistaken for a student, right? And she was always asked by her colleague, "Where are you from?" And she says, "I'm from Canada." And then she says, "Where are you really from?" that kind of thing is considered to be microaggression because that hurts, you know, the person's feeling. And also, she was included in a group photo with the students for the promotional material. Okay, she's an instructor, but you know, she was included as a student, right? Okay, so these things actually relate to institutional racism because these things happened partly because there were very, very few teachers of English like her, right? Okay. If the teaching, the teachers were very diverse, then maybe that wouldn't have happened, right? Okay. So institutional racism is ingrained in our institution, social institution, in education, healthcare, entertainment, sports, and legal system, and incarceration, and all these things are institutional racism. And so, for example, several years ago, there was a hashtag created, Oscar So White, to critique the lack of minority nominees for the Academy Awards, right? Okay. So that's part of institutional racism. And I want to focus on epistemological racism. So epistemological racism is racism, racial biases in our knowledge system that impact the knowledge production, distribution, and consumption. Okay? So I'm going to focus on this today. So as just one example, when I look back, I grew up in Japan, right? Okay. And my favorite subject was music. So when I was in elementary school, I looked forward to music classes, and we had to go to this music classroom, okay, with all the instruments and everything. And so this is a kind of typical music classroom that I reflect on. So as you can see, these portraits, at that time I didn't really think about it, but now I think about them. They are all European white male composers, right? So whenever I think about music, it's about the music composed by these people, and it's classical music. But when we think about music, music has been created and performed by so many people, so diverse people for so many years, right? I went to the Museum of Natural History yesterday, and I saw all these different kinds of instruments. And then they said, early, humans, they played music, right? But then when I think about music, I always think about music. Right? So it's really ingrained in your knowledge, right? And sometimes Japanese music teacher try to be like a European musician or composer or something and play the piano or something. Okay. Okay, so epistemological racism is sometimes called civilization racism. Or according to Gloria Joseph, who is a black feminist scholar, she calls it white studies or male studies. And so according to Gloria Joseph, racism in school knowledge is seen as focusing on achievements, cultures, experiences, and perspectives of white men and omitting or distorting the histories, experiences, cultures, and perspectives of people of color and women of all colors. Suresh Kanagaraja is very well-known scholar in our field, and years ago he promoted the concept of local knowledge, which has been suppressed by the Western mainstream epistemological paradigm, but it can offer an alternative thinking in research. Before moving on to more detailed discussion of epistemological racism, we need to think about intersectionality, right? Because race is not the only cause of social injustices, right? Okay. So race intersects with gender, class, ethnicity, language, sexuality, age, ability, physical ability, and all these things, they intersect with each other and produce the system of inequalities and privileges, right? So we need to think about this intersectionality. So epistemological racism, I will give you 3 examples, okay, concrete examples. So episode number 1, so in this episode, 2 researchers from Brazil, one is a friend of mine and another one is her graduate student. Okay, so they are in the field of language education and they conducted a research on the effectiveness of or the results of this pedagogical intervention in the university English classroom, focusing on some critical topics and themes, okay? And they wrote a paper, they submitted a paper to an international journal on language education, which is based in the United States, and they got outright rejection. And the editor wrote to them and said, you should frame your paper in a more global context. So my friend, we were at the conference in Rio de Janeiro, and she came to me, we received this comment from the editor, tell me what this means. I don't understand, right? But in this case, geographical south, global south, was not regarded as global enough, or was positioned outside of the global context, right? So this epistemological racism has to do with geographical implications as well. Okay. Episode number 2. So this is based on my own experience. So some years ago, I conducted research in Japan, funded by Japan Foundations, and I looked through interviews and some ethnographic research. I was interested in the views and experiences of Japanese adults learning English as a foreign language in non-formal contexts. Okay, so I wrote a paper and I submitted to another international journal based in the United States, and I got outright rejection. And the editor refused to share with me the original reviewer's comments, but he shared with me a summary of it. Okay, and at the end of the summary, it says, according to the editor, this is one of the reviewers, I believe that the manuscript may be of greater interest to specialists in the teaching, learning, and use of English in Japan. The author may wish to submit the manuscript to a journal with such an area of focus, such as Social Science Japan Journal or Journal of Japanese Studies. Okay. Now, these journals are not language education journals, and they rarely publish articles on language education or linguistics or applied linguistics, right? Okay. So in this case, this symbolizes the colonial exclusion of knowledge, and it's an attempt to contain the knowledge within the non-Western academic community. Okay. So luckily, I was able to publish this paper in Linguistics and Education. So I was very fortunate, and I was really happy about the outcome, ultimate outcome. Okay, another example. Okay. Simon introduced this in his introduction about several years ago. I co-edited with Evenson a book entitled Demystifying Career Path After Graduate School, a guide for second language professionals in higher education. So in this book, I was meant to provide some guidance for advanced graduate students and early career teachers in language studies and applied linguistics. So for example, how to get published, how to get tenure, and things like that, right? Okay. So we went to the major publisher to bring the proposal of the book, and we got rejected. So it seems like I get rejected all the time, but I have another paper that just been rejected. But anyway, so we went to the second publisher, okay, which had published similar books like this, okay? And in the end, the publisher said, these edited volumes don't do well. So we only accept one edited volume per year. So they rejected the proposal. Okay? And later, I was curious, so I went to the second publisher's website and looked at who was published, who were editors and who were authors. And I saw very, very few Asian names. So my thought then was, like this, title maybe won't sell according to the editor. I'm not sure. This is my guess, but this is what happened. Okay. Luckily, this book was published by Information. What's the name of the publisher? But anyway, Information Age publisher. Okay. So it's a good publisher, but we had to go through 2 rejections. Okay. So all these examples so talks about or resonates with the issues of race, location, and knowledge production. Okay. So it seems that the perceived legitimacy of knowledge is really linked to the location of knowledge production, as you saw the first and second episode, right? Location of knowledge production in the second episode, meaning like where I did my study, which is outside of North America. And also, what kind of location? And so there's this, West versus non-West, global South versus global North. So this kind of, location creates a significant impact on epistemological racism at the symbolic level. So it's not really about people. Well, sometimes it's about the authors, but it's about where the knowledge was produced, right? And also, dominance of English is implicated here because according to Littleson Curry's book, there is one example of East European non-English speaking scholar who was trying to publish her article on some issues in her own country in English, because English is supposed to be the international language, and you're supposed to publish in English journals, right? But she really struggles because, again, it's the same issue. So knowledge produced in non-Anglophone spheres is looked at as parochial, right? So even if this East European author is white, she really struggles with publication. Okay, and also race, ethnicity, both by names, my third example, right? So there has been some studies in US, Canada, and Australia, and they have the same results. Okay. So that these researchers conducted studies. It's kind of an experiment. So what they did was send out fake CDs to businesses, okay, with different names, okay, as applicants, okay, and see which names received the most callback rates for interviews, okay, and consistently the non-Anglo names are disadvantaged. So there's that biases attached to non-Anglo identities. And this also has to do with institutional racism as well, right? Okay, so this kind of white Eurocentric knowledge has given a lot of psychological impact on scholars of color, and also just people of color in general. Okay. So, for example, Francis Fanon, the post-colonial scholar, he argues that black people desires whiteness in terms of white culture, white language, white ways of doing thinking, right? And he calls it cultural imposition. Santi and Hall draws on a speech delivered by Malcolm X in 1960s that talks about the distinction between house Negroes and field Negroes during slavery. Okay, and house Negroes were trusted enough by white slave owners that they worked inside of the house, right? So they gradually appreciated the white culture, right? White ways of thinking, white ways of doing, and white music and so forth. And they even looked down upon field Negroes, the fellows working in the field. That resonates with that movie, Green Book, is that the title? Yeah. There was that scene where they, I can't remember the name of the main character. But anyway, he was in the car and he was looking outside, and there were slaves, or yeah, I guess, working in the field, right? And yeah, so that's really real. And also, non-native English speaker professionals. So NS is non-native English speaking professionals. Okay. So NS movement has been really active in the last maybe 20 years. Okay. So particularly English teachers. So I taught English in Japan and some in North America. So I am a non-native English speaking teacher, right? Okay. And some of your colleagues and some of you are non-native speaking French teacher or whatever language teacher, right? Okay. But in the last 20 years, in the field of teaching English as a second language or a foreign language, there has been a big non-nest movement where we said, we need to advocate ourselves, our rights, our identities. So there have been a lot of research on the identity of non-native teachers and all these other issues. However, Kubota critiques this movement because even though we are doing these research, nothing has changed in terms of the biases and discriminations that are targeted to non-native speakers, maybe hiring practices and so forth, right? So he critiques that's because non-native English teachers and researchers actually are complicit with the white knowledge. They don't come up with their own theories. They're just borrowing, white colleagues, white scholars' theories and so forth. Okay. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay. So, in a sense, so these non-native English scholars are traditional intellectuals rather than organic intellectuals. Right? So, we looked at this picture. Okay. So, in these cases, it seems that Asian scholars or scholars of color really buy into this English as deductive and linear and logical and so forth, right? So we need to really think about complicity in this knowledge structure. So about 2 weeks ago, I was listening to radio in Vancouver, and there was a radio program called Unreserved, and it features First Nations, Indigenous people in Canada. Okay, and there was a clip of interviews with Matika Wilbur. Anybody? So Matika Wilbur is Swinomish and Tulalip from Swinomish and Tulalip peoples of coastal Washington State. Okay, and she conducted Project 562. What is 562? There are 562 First Nations. So she went around the country and she photographed. She's a visual storyteller and artist, right? So she photographed those people, okay? And so in this episode, she talks about her own experience of doing this, and you can see, you can tell how this complicity works.
Event. So this is a clip from the first episode, and in it we're just kind of really getting to know the hosts. And here Matika Wilbur talks about her past work as a fashion photographer and how she shifted her focus into capturing Indigenous subtext.
I studied photography in school and advertising, and I did like we all do when we go through a commercial program. I was trained to become a photographer that makes money. And I distinctly remember one of my professors saying to me, well, if you want to make money, you should photograph more white people because you need skinny white women, a lot of them, in your portfolio if you want to work. That's what I did. And so when I graduated from college, I had this portfolio of really skinny white women, essentially. and then I went to Los Angeles and I started working in advertising and celebrity photography, and I remember this one day I was getting off on Sunset and La Brea, and I looked up at this ad that I had created, and it was this woman who, when we photographed her, was crying on set because she was so hungry. And I was like, girl, it's not a big deal. I'll get you some carrots. Like we have beautiful catering. And she was like, oh no, I don't eat before photo shoots. And I just remember thinking, like, I can't believe I'm participating in this. And then I looked up at the ad a couple months later and it said, live the life you've always wanted. And I immediately quit my job. And I did like you're supposed to do when you're having a sort of existential early life crisis. I went to South America. I traveled around. I got to meet a lot of really great Indigenous people, photographing them. And it was there, when I was there working with Indigenous folks, that I had this realization that I hadn't even photographed my own people.
That was Adrian Keene.
Right? Okay. So you see how her knowledge was really influenced by the supervisor or the professor's words that you have to photograph white people, right? Yeah. And on the same day, it was very interesting. About 2 weeks ago, Sunday, I heard another news story about journalism and issues of diversity. And I cannot locate it because I don't remember which program it was. I think it was NPR or something. And because I still listen to NPR. But anyway, so in this radio show, talked about the importance of diversifying the journalists, because a lot of media companies, they want more diverse voices in their news stories and things. So they try to hire more people of color, young journalists of color, right? But as soon as they get hired, they are under pressure to publish their articles and do things like as normal, sort of fit into this traditional ways of doing things. So even though they hire these a large number of journalists of color, the end result is the same. So this is another example of complicity. Okay. So there are researchers, scholars who have proposed alternative knowledge. So for example, Ray Connell proposes Southern theory, which is an umbrella term to signify the epistemological orientation that stands in opposition to Eurocentric knowledge. So Southern theory draws on post-colonial and indigenous perspectives and engages in alternative knowledge preservation, production, reconstruction, and application, while continuing to critique the hegemony of Northern theory. So other people, Asia as a method, Chen provincializing, Eurocentric, applied linguistics from the global south. The book just came out. Koni, Alatas, Yono, and Santos, and so forth. Right. So these people have proposed the epistemologies from the south. Okay, not just global south, but from post-colonial perspective, right? And in the field of education, there has been culturally responsive teaching as seen in Afrocentric education. I'm pretty sure in New York there are some Afrocentric schools. Probably, right?
Yes,
yeah?
there are.
Yes, there are. Yes, okay, right? So that really resonates with Southern theory, okay? However, this approach actually risks falling into Orientalist self-essentialization and fails to address the complexity of cultures and traditions that are to be rescued from Westernization. So for example, Fan Leha, another applied linguist, she argues that the scholarly discussions on the rise of Asia, maybe Asia as a method, actually reproduce the West Asia dichotomy while overlooking Asia's complex desire for the West as seen in the growing interest in English medium education. So if you go around the world, a lot of universities are creating English medium programs, right? And also, Anya Lumba problematizes the state nationalism in post-colonial politics in various parts of the world, which reclaims ethnic and racial unity, but it also strengthens religious fundamentalism, and that undermines the women's movement and class-based resistance. So this kind of epistemology of the South and the marginalized people can become, reactionary nationalism, which would typically exclude women and minorities. So coming back to this, so we switched negative to positive. So some of the scholars of color may support this, but that is good in one sense, but in another sense, maybe it contains some danger and some limitations. Okay, so just to show you some examples of this danger, there's a scholar called Yuki Otsuda, a Japanese scholar in applied linguistics, and he is a critic of English imperialism of English, linguistic imperialism of English. Okay. So linguistic imperialism of English became a very popular topic in academic research in 1990s. Okay, led by Robert Philipson and others. Okay, and he also critiques linguistic imperialism of English, which affects many aspects of Japanese society. Okay, so in 2010, he published this article speaking against the hegemony of English, and he promoted this mother tongueism to contest the hegemony of English. Earlier, he published this book in Japanese in 1996. Okay, it's titled "English That Invades, Japanese That Counterattacks. How do we protect our beautiful culture?" Okay. So when you look at the table of contents, you see the beautiful Japanese will restore our confidence, and what is necessary for us is the establishment of Japanese beauty and the harmony with nature is Japanese beauty. And that type of discourse actually resonates with Nihon Jinron, which is the emphasis on the uniqueness of Japanese culture and language, and that is appropriated by conservative right-wing politics, right? So it leads to nationalism and really problematic. Another example is this, okay, cultural discourse analysis. And one of the person who is actively doing research in this field is Xin Shu, and he is based in China, and he published this article in 2009, reconstructing Eastern paradigms of discourse studies. Okay, and in this article, he says the U.S. West-dominated international communication system, including media, literature, education, social science, as well as everyday talk, has often portrayed Asia, Africa, and Latin America as backward, repressive, totalitarian, corrupt, warlike, etc., as opposed to the modern, democratic, free, peace-loving West, which have tremendous consequences on the well-being and prospects of the underdeveloped and developing countries. Okay? And then he goes on to say, East societies traditionally take humane and communal consciousness and so harmony with others and with nature to be the highest principle of contact and communication. So it's kind of similar to what Tsuda was saying, like harmony with nature and things. Okay, so far so good, but then the question is who is excluded from this kind of discourse. So I happen to be in a conference, very small conference on Southern epistemologies held at Penn State earlier this fall, and Xin Shu was speaker, and he Skyped in from China. Okay, so he was on the screen, and we were listening to his talk, and he talked about the difference between the national defense discourse of the United States and that of China. Okay, and he was saying that the U.S. National defense discourse is more aggressive, violent, whereas Chinese discourse is more, less violent, less aggressive, peace-seeking, blah blah blah. And then sitting next to me, okay, in the audience, right, was a Taiwanese American young graduate student of indigenous background, and she was saying, is she thinking about Taiwan? And then there were some other people in the audience from Hong Kong, graduate students from Hong Kong, and probably they felt quite upset. So you see the same problem right here. Okay, so who's excluded? So any nationalistic discourse excludes, tend to exclude women, and also people, marginalized people, ethnically, racially, and linguistically, right? And so we looked at all these alternatives and problem. So what is the solution, right? So I looked at Black feminist epistemologies. And so these epistemologies are proposed by Patricia Hill Collins, Gloria Joseph, and others. And Annette Henry actually summarized these epistemologies and said they use the characteristics are the use of dialogue in assessing knowledge claims, centrality of personal expressiveness, ethics of personal accountability, and concrete experience as a criterion of meaning. So I wanted to focus on this ethics of personal accountability. And this personal accountability applies to everyone, all of us, me, you, and students as well, right? Okay. And a big issue for me is gender, because I'm a woman of color, non-native speaker of English, teaching in North American University, and gender is a very important issue. So some feminist scholars have focused on this and critiqued the male dominance of academic knowledge production. For example, Rainey Connell, who proposed Salon theory, critiques the Boaventura de Souza Santos because his work actually overrepresents the ideas produced by male scholars of the left in post-colonial orientations. Okay. And also, Anya Lumba critiques Frantz Fanon's work because he overlooks both black and white women in psychoanalysis colonized. Okay. So there are some blind spots, even though I have been, citing, for example, Fanon for a long time, but I didn't really think about this omission of women, right? So this ethics of personal accountability is very important. So Patricia Hill Collins, a black feminist scholar, talks about classroom discussion, example of classroom discussion. Okay, so in this classroom, her students discussed the famous black male scholars' analysis of black feminism. So the students wanted to examine the author's personal biography in order to validate his claims. Okay? So I'm quoting Collins. So the students used this information to assess whether he really cared about his topic and drew on his ethics of caring in advancing their knowledge claims about his work. Furthermore, the students refused to evaluate the rationality of his written ideas without some indication of his personal credibility as an ethical human being. So I argue and propose that male scholars of color, or any scholars for that matter, me too, are held accountable for their ethics of personal commitment and result-oriented action in promoting alternative untitled epistemology. And also ethical engagement that challenges non-performativity is essential to epistemological anti-racism. So Sarah Ahmed actually looked at the policy documents of UK universities and that focuses on anti-racism and multiculturalism, and she argued that all these documents tend to be really smooth, eloquent documents, but the actual action is not seen. So she calls it non-performativity. Right? So how do we enact epistemological anti-racism in our academic work? First, we need to seek an alternative worldviews of Southern theory. That's for sure. And second, we need to develop critical awareness of our citation practices. So this is very concrete suggestion, and I hadn't thought about this before, but I think this is a very powerful thing to do. Okay? It's very difficult for maybe graduate students, undergraduate students, but for established scholars like us, tenured scholars, we can experiment. So we need to ask, who do I cite and why? Right? Should I cite a well-known male European scholar on post-humanism, for example, whose ideas closely resonate with indigenous worldviews of nature, land, and animals, and yet who gives no credit to indigenous scholarship? Should we cite this person? If these male scholars with white Euro-American epistemologies ignore indigenous or women scholars, why should we continue to mention their work? Should I cite well-known scholars who do not demonstrate their ethics of personal accountability? If I do, will I become complicit with academic colonialization and oppression? And how can I reconcile the practical need to get my work accepted with the promotion of anti-racist and anti-sexist causes? Very practical questions, right? But I think this is something we need to think of. So in conclusion, I'm quoting Collins, knowledge claims made by individuals respected for their moral and ethical connections to their ideas will carry more weight than those offered by less respected figures. So I propose all scholars, including subalterns, need to stay critically self-reflexive and establish professional coherence. And finally, we must question how power is implicated in knowledge production, distribution, and consumption to seek epistemic and human equality and justice. So here are some selected references, and this concludes my talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kubota, for this inspiring and useful, necessary, good presentation. Let us move on to the Q&A.
Yes.
If you have any questions, that would be the time to pose them.
Yes. Any questions? Yes.
So I guess this is more of a comment, but maybe there's a question
Yes.
in the comment. I really enjoyed your talk, and thank you for sharing these ideas. I was thinking that I work with a program that supports less commonly taught languages at Columbia. And Columbia is really a complexly intersectional space. And there are areas of greater privilege and areas of lesser privilege. And I can't help but feel that this notion of epistemological racism extends not just to a group or to an individual, but also to a language. And that some of the languages that we promote and attempt to support are, in a sense, the recipients of this latent type of racism. And that may cause fewer students to take these languages. And as in our attempts to give rationales for taking the language, one thing that I fear is that we're kind of re-proposing that same type of logic by saying, oh, this is a less commonly taught language, it's special, so here's a special thing you can do with it. So that, in your talk, you pointed out many sort of these complex dyads where if you do one thing, it's difficult to figure out how to find the right balance. So I guess my question is, do you feel that your concepts can extend also into the issue of languages themselves and beyond simply just an individual or group?
Yeah, sure, I think so. Yeah, because language is the medium of production of knowledge. So I think it's part of it. And I think you raised a very interesting topic. And I would like to look into that too, because some languages gets this label of being sophisticated and right, and other languages are stereotyped into really backward or so I think racism has to do with that too, right? Who speaks that language, right? Yeah. So. And people have, linguistic discriminations, linguicism, according to Robert Ferguson. He calls it linguisticism, right? And also Tobit's campus. So linguisticism is a linguistic discrimination, and people listen to some language and they think that this person is educated or sophisticated. They listen to another language and immediately give more derogatory labeling, right? So I think that's another area that we need to really critically look at. And actually, there's a study called reverse linguistic stereotypes. Okay, so linguistic stereotypes are the stereotypes that you have about certain, language. Okay, so for example, you listen to certain, sound clip of certain language, and you immediately have some kind of stereotype about that person or about that culture, right? So that's linguistic stereotype. But reverse linguistic stereotype is when you look at the speaker's, attributes, maybe the skin color or facial, shapes, and that triggers the speaker's linguistic ability and professional ability. So that's called reverse linguistic stereotype. And there has been a lot of experiments, and particularly English and particularly English actually. Yeah, English. So English is spoken by so many people. I mean, you all speak English, but you all come from different racial backgrounds, right? Yeah. So so in this experiment, there are two classes of university students, for example, in Columbia or any one class, the students look at instructor's picture, which is Asian female instructor. Okay. In another class, they look at instructor's picture, which is European white person. Okay. And then they listen to the same audio recorded lecture, recorded by native speaker of English, standardized native speaker of English. And then after the lecture, they fill out the comprehension questions and listening comprehension questions, and also questionnaire about the perceived effectiveness as a teacher and personality and things like that. And consistently, the white teacher actually gets a higher score, right? So there's that, intersectionality of language and race, clearly demonstrated. So that's slightly different from what you were saying, but
I see that as well. Another language I know is Italian, and in Italian, this is sort of an anecdote, but a thing that people say sometimes is, oh, they use the word Zulu to mean a foreign person or a strange person. But I also just this week sat in on a Zulu class, and it was, these two experiences are completely different. It was an amazing class. The teacher was wonderful. The students were so engaged, and I think, wow, there's this form of racism built into the Italian language itself, and yet to experience it firsthand, it's totally undone.
wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so I think there are lots of areas that we need to look at, when we teach language, racism, and also intersectionality, right? It's not just about language and race, it's gender too, right? So, any other issues? Or questions, or your own experience teaching, or your success story?
Yeah. I teach Japanese here, and my students always say, oh, I want to learn a Tokyo dialect or maybe standard Japanese only, because the Tokyo dialect is associated with coolness maybe. But they don't have any idea, or maybe they are not interested in learning other dialects. And then that is also related to like linguistic bigotries or maybe prejudices. Now, because you are used to teach Japanese, and I'd like to change that perception as a Japanese teacher. What kind of things would you think about?
I think maybe the first step is to look at the regional varieties, of that language, and that's very important. And particularly, former colonial languages, that spread so many different countries, right? And within that country, there are so many, regional dialects and things. It's so important to break that stereotype, the French is only spoken in France, it's spoken in Quebec as well, and and other, African countries and other countries as well, right? I think typically, I don't know about now, but before, like high school textbooks, Spanish textbook, usually Spain, and some Latin American countries, but no mention of indigenous people, and that kind of thing. So I think to raise students' awareness of linguistic diversity, racial diversity, I think we need to really think about what to include in our curriculum, textbooks, classrooms. Yes.
Just going to add to the marking theory. At least we, from the country that I come from, the area that I come from, we have what we call the kitchen Swahili. And kitchen Swahili is a kitchen Swahili that the woman who is the wife of the colonialist, who uses the Swahili to talk to the cooks, who are the Africans and the servants, where she doesn't speak grammatically anything but just words here and there and so on. So we call that kitchen Swahili. And then there's the quote-unquote, the master in a sense of the employer, the male white person who is the one who's in charge of the house or the household. So he has his Swahili to the other people, which are basically all in commands. Nothing, everything is commands. So you have those. And so for us, for the marking of it, is we play around with it when we want to mark them. To say like, you are sounding like this. So we play around with kitchen Swahili to overturn the racism, invert it towards them rather than ourselves.
Right.
So there's that part of marking that you can play it on both sides.
That's right. Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah.
And it becomes a very comic. It's very comedic. You know, the comedians catch it like, they play with it all the time.
I think that's happening today. And there is circumstances as well. Probably not in colonial sense, but like in businesses, right, in different parts of the world. Interesting. Any other comments? Yes.
Well, if nobody else has a comment, I would like to say something. Thank you for the talk. I think it's, again, very much needed, and especially in the current times called for. Your initial diagrams when you were displaying the different structures of languages by Kaplan from the 60s, that reminded me of something that I saw during my discourse analysis seminars, where we looked into various argumentation structures between different languages. And it is indeed the case that sometimes students do come into foreign language class with certain assumptions about, well, this, I'm taking German, so this is a very logical language, and therefore the argumentation will be very straightforward, just like in English. And it turns out that English is not very straightforward. There are a lot of hedging mechanisms that are employed on an everyday basis. And where I'm going with this is maybe one way to sort of work around it and to show that there shouldn't really be any different treatment discrimination, is to maybe look at these kinds of structures or argumentation patterns in class, and that could be definitely done at the advanced level, maybe at the beginner's level too. I don't know if this is something that you maybe thought about or have even done in your own teaching?
Yeah, in the teaching, I think, so the problem of that model is also just completely disregarding the genres, right? Because there are so many different kinds of texts that we read and write every day, right? So, for example, like even shopping list or something, that could be a text, and that should be really clearly written. Even like newspaper, I think nowadays people just read it online. Traditional newspaper, from stories. These news stories are very different from opinion columns, right? And other kind of columns, and so we need to think about the genres, right, and the purposes of this text, and then compare contrast maybe, and then there are maybe some similarities across languages, maybe differences in literature. Creative writing is very traditional maybe, and have some kind of tradition, but then more academic writing, like social sciences, science, STEM, field, probably the same. And I heard that for science paper, scientists, they have to publish so many papers, right, in English, and then there's computer application, and you just put in all the information, and then creates a paper for you. Kind of, right? I mean, you still have to go back and do it, but it's so formulaic, and so depending on what it is, right? And then we can talk about maybe cultural traditions, and for example, Japanese haiku. I don't know if anything like that exists in other parts of the world, but like tradition and also some commonalities. And if we see commonalities, what causes commonality, right? People, interactions and globalization and technology, all these things. So that would be a very good discussion with students.
Yeah, I think that paying attention to these commonalities would serve to sort of subvert these notions of superiority of one language over the other, one culture over the other.
Any other questions, comments, experiences that we would like to share?
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank Dr. Kubota for